She resigned from the US State Department in protest at US complicity in genocide. Anel Shalin is one of a few US officials who resigned, unfortunately too few, but history will judge them very kindly. She knows far better than most the inside story of the US government and its complicity in genocide. She's just written a new report for the Quincy Institute about the US role in this genocide, with a really disturbing point that she raises that I really want to talk to her about. Before I ask her about that, I want to talk about what this really important report was exposing, and is exposing the broader context that we need to talk about US support for this genocide.
Thanks so much for having me back and for everything you've been doing to continue to draw attention to the genocide. So in this report, as you said, it's in the context of what the United States has been supporting Israel's genocide in Gaza, but it also looks into history and the fact that the United States, as long as maintaining military primacy remains the overarching objective of our foreign policy, human rights will never be prioritized. And what's interesting is even going back in the law, human rights and weapons sales are supposed to be linked. Back in the aftermath or sort of in the context of Vietnam, you had this notion that human rights should actually influence US foreign policy, and you had a Congress that implemented laws saying that the United States is not to sell weapons or provide any security assistance to a country that engages in gross violations of human rights. And yet that law, 502B, which is part of the Foreign Assistance Act, has never actually been implemented. And subsequently, there are other laws that have also been violated, things like the Leahy laws, which are about U.S. security assistance or weapons going to a specific military unit that has engaged in gross violations of human rights, or things like if a country is blocking U.S. humanitarian assistance, they're no longer eligible to receive U.S. security assistance. But these are all sort of under the framework of this broader overarching law that the U.S. is not supposed to provide weapons or any sort of security assistance to these kinds of countries. And so what I argue in the report is to actually uphold that, the U.S. would have to fundamentally rethink our whole approach to foreign policy. This isn't something that we could sort of do on the margins. It does require a really fundamental rethink, which I do advocate for. But obviously, in the context of something like looking at the Biden administration, which liked to talk a lot about human rights, and certainly as someone who was working in the Human Rights Office focused on Near East affairs under Biden, it was quite obvious even long before October 7th that human rights were not, in fact, a priority, despite the fact that they like to use that rhetoric a lot. And then obviously in the aftermath of October 7th, the glaring hypocrisy, in particular the emphasis, the justified and important emphasis on the human rights of Ukrainians, but the complete disregard for the human rights of Palestinians, just that the hypocrisy was so blinding.
There's a striking point you made, which I'll before I come on to, because there was a really striking point in the report you made. But I mean, last year it was revealed, in fact, last April, that 2 US government agencies had concluded that Israel was deliberately preventing humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza. Both the State Department's refugee agency and US Aid, which has obviously now been dismantled, and that legally required the United States to cease arms sales to Israel, because under US law, any state which is preventing US aid from the United States from entering is legally prohibited from receiving weapon sales. And Antony Blinken was informed of this, and the Biden administration ignored that law.
Exactly. This is what my State Department colleague Stacey Gilbert resigned over. This was if people remember, about almost a year ago, the NSM 20, where the Biden administration had said they were going to sort of implement a mechanism or this means of looking deeper into what Israel was doing. And Stacey and other colleagues who've been working on this report and determined that, yes, Israel is blocking U.S. humanitarian aid and so is ineligible to receive any additional security assistance. They lost access to this report they were writing. And instead, what the State Department published declared the opposite. And Stacey quit over that. And this is someone who had overseen, as she described it, many U.S. foreign policy decisions that maybe she didn't agree with, but she was sort of believed in the overarching mission of the State Department. And again, this sort of belief that the US is a force for good in the world, which is so pervasive at state. And unfortunately, I think it's just remains such a large part of American exceptionalism. And this is a big part of what I'm trying to push against in the report, is this notion that American primacy or American military power advocates for human rights, when in fact, I argue it's the opposite, that as long as the US continues to actually pursue military power, which is often manifested through weapons sales, human rights are never going to be a priority. And under Trump, some people would say, well, none of this matters anyway. Trump doesn't care about human rights. And I would argue that in many ways, the way that the Biden administration said it cared about human rights, or would use this kind of rhetoric, or talk about its support for democracies and all of this kind of thing, in many ways is more pernicious and more insidious, because it signals that it's actually adequate to mention human rights, to use the pretty language, to say you care, and then to do the opposite, and to show that all that human rights really means to the US government is to deploy the rhetoric and not change the policy, in contrast to someone like Trump, who very clearly does not value human rights, is clearly not upholding them for US residents or US American citizens, people in this country. And it's easier, I would argue, for those who do believe that human rights are important, obviously not only for Americans, for people all over the world, and that we are all better off when countries respect human rights. It's easier to push back against someone who's sort of openly against that idea, and it has a unifying effect, as opposed to someone like Biden and his administration, where it was harder, like people who sort of saw like, well, maybe their issue is being advanced, well, I'm not going to criticize the ways that they're not actually holding up the broader spectrum of human rights. I think one thing in particular that the Biden administration did do was to emphasize much more the rights of LGBTQIA plus people around the world, which is commendable. But then it's sort of like, or like, the rights of Ukrainians. And so it sort of splinters the overarching human rights coalition, which against someone like Trump can say, no, human rights do matter. We need to enforce international laws on this. We need to enforce domestic laws on this. Whereas under Biden, it really, he sort of was able to successfully splinter what might otherwise be a coalition.
Well, the striking thing, one of the striking things in what you wrote, was that the Israeli state didn't expect the US to give them carte blanche to engage in its war of annihilation, essentially, against Gaza for more than a few weeks. I mean, I remember back then, I have to say, look, it's been a year and a half of this, and I think if any of us could transport ourselves back to those first week or two and say, in a year and a half, this will still be going on, I think that would have been, almost mind-blowing, actually, to be honest. But that's what happened. But the Israeli state didn't think they'd be able to get away with it, and yet they did. How would you expand on that?
Yeah, so that has been reported publicly. That was reported by The Economist, this idea that the Israelis anticipated, similarly to other instances in history, including the Biden White House itself, when Israel was engaging in the bombardment of Gaza in May of 2021, and after a matter of weeks, the Biden White House said, okay, that's enough. And looking back through history, the famous call Reagan made during Israel's attack on Beirut, Reagan seeing like one picture of a child, a Lebanese child devastated, who'd been either killed or maimed by Israel's assault on Lebanon, and that was enough for Reagan to call and say, all right, this needs to stop. And instead, you saw the Biden administration continuing to provide essentially unconditional support. And one thing I find so maddening is the Republican talking point that Biden was constraining Israel in some way because they blocked a single shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, which is okay, a single shipment of, like, you look at, in the report, I have a graph from Stephen Semler, who's excellent at, like, sort of visualizing some of these figures. And you look at, like, US support for Israel over time, and then you look at the past, just under Biden, the 12 months in the aftermath of October 7th, $17.9 billion above the $3.3 billion that the US sends to Israel every year as a matter of course. I do think that one question that I keep hearing and that I've grappled with myself is kind of what explains this, of why did they continue to just provide this unconditional support. And I think one thing to keep in mind is this notion of the bear hug policy, this idea that if there's no daylight between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government, then they can influence Netanyahu and we can save lives. And this was something that I heard from Blinken himself, who met with myself and others from the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, who were very concerned. And at the time that this meeting happened, it was right when there was that initial ceasefire around Thanksgiving in November of 2023. And so it seemed that actually that logic was correct, and that by providing this massive level of support to Israel, then the US could facilitate a ceasefire. But over time, it should have become clear that Netanyahu was not willing to engage in any sort of ceasefire again. And it was only Trump actually using leverage, and my understanding is possibly even threatening to withhold US weapons, that actually finally got Netanyahu to agree to at least phase one of the ceasefire. And obviously now the Trump administration is parroting the same lies, that it was Hamas that violated the ceasefire, when it wasn't. It was Israel. But yeah, this dogged persistence in maintaining the Biden administration just continuing to pretend that they were actually trying to push for a ceasefire when they were using zero leverage and instead just allowing Netanyahu to do whatever he wanted.
I mean, what do you think is really driving that? I mean, as you know, in the past, Ronald Reagan, when he rang then the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and said, stop this Holocaust, is what he said. And then, I mean, even after 9/11, in the early 2000s, George Bush's administration issued a condemnation of Israel bombing a Hamas target. So they killed a Hamas official, but they killed several civilians in the process. And, you end up with look, that's not whitewash the Democrats who started the Vietnam War. But I mean, what do you think is driving that? What do you think is so, in this case, do you think it was US policy meets Joe Biden's own kind of fanatical position on Israel? I mean, in the mid-1980s, he said in Congress as a senator, it was the best multi-billion-pound investment the US had ever made. If Israel didn't exist, we'd have to create it. And he wasn't talking there from a kind of moral perspective of the Jewish people need a state. He was talking about US strategic interests in that speech. So what do you think is driving it?
Yes, I think absolutely. It was Biden's deep commitment to Zionism. I think it's racism. I think it's this willingness to see brown and black bodies destroyed in a way that clearly sort of the European and American reaction to Russia's assault on Ukraine and seeing, blonde, blue-eyed Ukrainian refugees was seen as unacceptable. I think that there was this perception. The Biden administration was trying to achieve what the Trump administration had done with the Abraham Accords. They wanted to expand them. They wanted Israel and Saudi Arabia to normalize relations. And I think they continued to see that as a possibility, even though, even someone like Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was saying, I cannot normalize with Israel, they'll assassinate me. And we demand the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, as sort of our starting position for normalization. And I mean, just this dogged unwillingness by the Biden people to recognize what was happening, even to the point of losing the election over this. That the poll finding that 29% of people who voted for Biden in 2020, who didn't vote for Harris in 2024, for whom their primary issue was Gaza, and that outranked inflation or immigration, like that was the most important issue. They lost the White House over this. And now we've got Trump. And, I think it's really frustrating when people say, well, now you have Trump and he's even worse. If your main issue was Palestine, then you should have voted for Harris because she would have been better on this. I don't think she would have been. It was, and Trump at least was willing to impose a measure of leverage that it did achieve a ceasefire. And even now, recently with Netanyahu visiting, we saw Netanyahu not walking away with what he wanted. He was alarmed by the fact the U.S. and Iran are talking directly. He wanted to get Trump to lift the 17% tariffs on Israeli goods, and he wanted Trump to make some kind of commitment to defend Israel against Turkey. And instead, Trump told him, you need to be reasonable, and I really like Erdogan. So unfortunately, on Gaza, Trump is not reigning in Israel. But on other issues, it does seem clear that Trump has a better understanding of what U.S. interests, at least is unwilling to be led around by the nose by Netanyahu the way Biden was. And to this question of, what you quoting Biden as far as this notion that Israel is so useful for U.S. national security interests in the Middle East. I mean, increasingly that is just becoming harder and harder to defend, given Israel's war on Lebanon, attacks on Syria, continued annexation of the West Bank, which is going to destabilize Jordan, who's a key U.S. partner in the region, and also a key partner for Israel. The question of what will happen, I mean, Egypt has been complicit in maintaining the blockade and the starvation of people in Gaza. But if somehow, there's a mass exodus of Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai in Egypt, I mean, that could threaten the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty. I mean, Israel is just behaving in a manner that is counterproductive, certainly to American security or long-term security interests in the Middle East, but even to its own security. And the U.S. continues to enable this kind of behavior, mostly just to keep Netanyahu out of jail, because he has to maintain his coalition of these extreme right-wing ministers or face accountability for his own corruption and fraud.
I mean, I guess finally, I'm just interested in what hope is there. I mean, because this is structural. That's the point you're making. It's a structural problem. And whoever, whether it was, Harris, Biden, Trump, a similar outcome. So, because when I've interviewed a few times the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, he thinks that hope will come when public opinion in the United States reaches a tipping point, which politicians can't ignore. What do you think? Where is the hope given the kind of structural problem you're talking about?
I mean, at least on this question, I would agree with him on that point that U.S. public opinion is crucial here. And at the same time that you see even Republicans, like negative views of Israel increasing, even among Republicans and certainly among Democrats. But at the same time, I think in a recent Pew poll, fewer people said that this was a really important issue to them. So on the one hand, I do think that it signals over the long run, Israel will no longer enjoy the same measure of bipartisan unconditional support. But at the same time, I think people are distracted. And so for those of us for whom, who are trying to do what we can to continue to raise the alarm bells about this genocide and also just what this means for sort of the broader, what implications this has moving forward, I do think continuing to talk to people around you to bring this up, we have the numbers and we could have even greater numbers. And I do think it's really astonishing given the measure of coercion that the Trump administration is turning to try to terrify people into not speaking out about these issues, including people like trying to deport Mahmoud Khalil, who may be deported, snatching other graduate students off the street, sending them into detention, people self-deporting out of fear over this. I understand that people are afraid, but at the same time, governments cannot withstand if enough, and again, it's not even that many. I think people keep talking about the 3.5% of a population is all it takes to essentially force a government to pay attention to what they're demanding. And I do think that is growing, and I do think that people even on the political right, I mean, it's just horrifying what we continue to see happening in Gaza. I think my concern is that even if in the long run the United States starts to move away from this sort of bipartisan unconditional support for Israel, I don't know who's going to be left in either Gaza or the West Bank by then, given the ongoing efforts to starve and bomb people in Gaza into leaving and forcing them to try to escape. And again, with the annexation of the West Bank, we are seeing very similar degrees of violence. So I think for the longer run, there is some hope politically that we'll start to see a shift here. But I do worry that we don't have time to wait for that. And so I would encourage people to continue to post about this, to share videos, to talk about this. I do think people are distracted, especially in Washington. I mean, there's so much going on. But this is a genocide. And those of us who've been sort of screaming about it for a year and a half now, maybe it feels like we're screaming into the void, but I do think the level of coercion they're using shows that they're feeling desperate, and that they're having to sort of show their hand with what is required to maintain or to try to suffocate support for Palestine, I think does seem to show that we're winning.
Amen. Anel, thank you so much as ever for your wisdom, your insights, and I think as well giving a bit of hope about what people can actually achieve, and not actually giving up in the face of what is a genocide, as you say. But what you've done is so important, and history will record those who did actually take a stand and paid a price. And history is always very kind in those circumstances. For those watching, please like and subscribe, leave your comments, very important, help get Anel's voice out, share the video. But Anel, honestly, thank you so much as ever.
Thank you. You've been such an important voice on this, so really appreciate all of your work.
Well, we're all trying to do our bit, but bless you.